This morning on The Real Story, with kids back in classrooms, needs are more apparent. We're checking in with the Village, talking about new challenges, what resources are available, and insight into the proposals and funding impacting Connecticut families. But first, before we talk back to school, this former Connecticut teacher is back on the ballot. Connecticut's 5th district could completely change the balance of power in Congress and the policies passed over the next 2 years. Ahead, our one-on-one with U.S. Representative Jahana Hayes, why she feels this race is so close, what she's brought to the chambers, and her struggle with House leadership and relationship with Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. That and more ahead on The Real Story. Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. In just about 6 weeks, Connecticut voters will be able to start casting their ballots. On those ballots, the next president of the United States, state races you've probably seen ads and lawn signs all over for, as well as congressional races, which could decide the balance of power on Capitol Hill. The laws you follow and what's funded in your everyday life. I spoke one-on-one with the 5th District's Congresswoman Jahana Hayes as her race is once again looking to be a close call. She's back now from Chicago after furthering her campaign and casting Connecticut's delegate votes at the Democratic National Convention.
Tonight, we cast 73 votes and 1 president for the first female president of the United States of America, Kamala Harris!
So much has changed in this 2024 election season in just a matter of weeks. I know you and I chatted a little bit right after Harris took over and President Biden stepped down in the campaign. But, you know, for you personally, you have a relationship with Kamala Harris. You've known her. You were there. You were the one who got to announce those votes for Connecticut on the floor of the DNC. What did it feel like to be able to do that, to be able to cast those votes for Harris, you know, who is a Black woman who could be she's already a historic nominee, but could be also a historic president?
Well, it was wonderful for me personally. I mean, it was a truly humbling experience. I mean, everyone in our state, Connecticut, we had the first female governor as the first Black woman to ever represent the state of Connecticut in the Congress. To be able to cast the vote for a future President Harris was literally just me realize every door of opportunity just burst open for so many people. I've heard in the time that I've been home since the convention from so many people how proud they were of our state, and, you know, just to see that happening. But I think for me, even equally as important, the policies of this administration are something that I know have helped my family, have helped the people that I represent. So to be able to continue that work with someone who I consider a friend, who has been so incredibly supportive of me throughout my entire time in Congress, who has worked with me on legislation, someone who I was, I think, a little bit personally protective of when there were conversations about just this free-for-all process. And I was like, no, we cannot throw her into this without the full support of the Democratic caucus. So to be able to cast that vote really just was a full circle moment for me.
Of those, you know, more than 70 votes for Harris, one of Connecticut's delegate votes was present. We spoke on the show, you know, with that delegate from West Hartford 2 weeks ago about his experience there. And, you know, it was interesting. He was telling us, you know, he does fully support the Harris-Walz ticket, but wanted to kind of use that as a way to, you know, express his voice and show, you know, his frustrations. He, you know, calls himself a ceasefire delegate, obviously protesting the war in Gaza, wanting a ceasefire, wanting an arms embargo on Israel. We know there were a couple other delegates as well as volunteers at the DNC feeling similarly. What was your reaction to that? And do you think there needs to be any more room for those conversations, whether it's within the party or in Congress right now?
Well, I proudly cast those 73 votes for Kamala Harris and the one present, because in the Democratic Party, there is room for dissension. People can have differences of opinion, and I think we welcome that. And I know that a Harris-Walz administration will help to bring us to on the path to peace that we are trying to pursue. Both President Biden and Vice President Harris have talked about the need for a ceasefire, have talked about a negotiated peace where Palestinian people have full rights over themselves, that they are at the table. This is a very, very complex issue. Both of them have said they want a ceasefire. This requires stabilization in the region. It requires a Netanyahu to come to the table and not be a barrier to peace or obstructing it. So I think that dissenting voices within our party is the mark of the process of the democratic process. But I know that the contrast, a Trump administration who has not even acknowledged the pain and suffering of people in Palestine, in Gaza, and Palestinian people, would be highly problematic. So I will continue to work with this administration to try to pursue peace in that region, to end this war, to have a release of all of the hostages and bring them home, and to make sure that we can stabilize and support that region so that Palestinian people can have self-determination.
Obviously, just a matter of weeks now before we have early voting here in Connecticut. Still a little while until November, but in late October, polls will open here in Connecticut. And obviously, as we've been talking about, everyone's, of course, focused on the presidential race, but a lot of other races down ballot, including yours in the 5th district. Your district has been close, though, in 2022. You're going up again against your Republican challenger, George Logan. But of course, your race is an important one, not only to the people in your district and the whole state, but for, power in Congress as a whole. What's on your mind for these upcoming weeks? And what do you hope is really on voters' minds before they head to the polls?
Turning out votes. I mean, in the last cycle, it did come down to a narrow margin, but that would have been Republicans' best opportunity to flip a seat in a midterm election where Democrats were predicted to lose upwards of 50 seats. And I was able to hold on to this seat. And I believe it was because of the policies. In this next election, turning out votes is going to be incredibly important. And not just for the top of the ticket, but for control over the Congress. The houses where votes are certified. We have a Speaker, Mike Johnson, who is the architect of denying the last election. I fear that a free and fair election will not be certified under his leadership. Many of the policies that we're talking about, a woman's right to choose, Project 2025 agenda, what happens next with the sunsetting of these Trump tax cuts, the House will decide, the Speaker of the House decides what is even put up for a vote. So for us to be able to vote on the issues that people in this district care the most about, the Farm Bill, things like that, we have to have a resounding and overwhelming victory. We have about 3 more weeks. We have to fund the government. So we have a lot of work to do. And I fear that much of the legislation that will be put on the floor will be about chaos, about confusion, and not truly legislating. It will be legislation there's a piece of legislation that everyone talks about, the SAVE Act, that says that you have to have a passport to vote. You can't even use a driver's license or a military ID, which we know it would continue to disenfranchise people. The Farm Bill, which is at an impasse and funding expires on September 30th. One of the holdups in that was they wanted to cut $30 billion from nutrition programs and give it to corporate farmers. I've worked really hard to feed children. I just introduced legislation to end the School Hunger Elimination Act, to make sure that children who qualify for SNAP and Medicaid would automatically qualify for free school lunch without having that added barrier. I've introduced probably a dozen similar bills to address nutrition and hunger. So it's very interesting. I hear my opponent talk about bipartisanship. A hard line for me is feeding people. That's not something that my Republican colleagues want to join or collaborate on legislation like that. But if you look at the legislation that I've introduced and the 11 bills that I've had passed, they directly address our most vulnerable communities, our children, our veterans, our women, things that literally groups of people who have been targeted over and over again. So I'm really proud of the work that I've done, really proud of the fact that I've been able to actually have my legislation that I led, sponsored, and introduced passed into law through 2 administrations. And I'd like to continue to do that work because even though this is a frontline district, even though it's a vulnerable district, it doesn't mean that the people should be left behind. So I will continue to champion policies that directly impact people, not the wealthy, well-connected, not the highest income earners, although I represent them as well, but people who are traditionally and historically left behind, people like me. I've always said I want to be the Congresswoman that I needed for someone to be for me. And I'm really proud of the fact that I'm able to do that. I'm able to introduce legislation that feeds children.
And when it comes to children, you talked about how important it is to keep them fed. That's a big part of learning. I've heard on the state level in Connecticut here as well. But, you were a teacher, you care a lot about education, and there's been a lot about laws and funding supporting mental health resources as well. We know, especially post-pandemic, that's been a huge topic of discussion, and specifically trauma-informed education. What do you think Congress could or should be doing around that?
I just did a panel on the proposals in Project 2025 that directly impact education. They want to completely eliminate the Department of Education and roll back Title I funding, which directly impacts children around our state. 2/3 of the funding from Title I that is funding for children with disabilities, those wraparound services, before and after school care, tutoring services, school social workers, nurses, all of the things that I know put kids on green and ready to learn. Just trying to roll back all of those programs, which would make it twice as hard for teachers to reach students. Education should be about meeting children where they are, and everyone should have access to a high quality education, not just kids from communities where they have the resources, not just kids from families where they have strong vocal advocates, but every child. So making sure that we are properly funding education so that we make sure it doesn't matter what community you live in, that everyone has access to those opportunities. This Project 2025 proposal wants to eliminate programs like Head Start. Even as a high school teacher, I understood and recognized that when children had a strong foundation early in life that carried them throughout their academic journey, they had better health and well-being, better social and emotional skills. They were ready to learn, job training programs. These are all of the things that I fought really hard for because I know that the kids who sat in my classroom oftentimes had one shot at getting this right. And I wanted to make sure I opened those doors of opportunity.
We mentioned a lot as well about, the food and nutrition aspect of this. And I want to talk a little bit more about, where it comes from. Your district, as well as much of Connecticut, has a lot of agricultural roots. What are you advocating for specifically in that arena, especially after the unfortunate and deadly flooding, we saw the past couple weeks? I know you've been working on, climate mitigations and solutions in that way for farmers. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, that's just it. I'm the only member from Connecticut who sits on the House Ag Committee, and I asked for this committee. I have lots of small farmers and greenhouse growers who have historically been left behind in these large funding packages. I wanted to make sure that small and family farmers were represented. Things like access to capital, technical assistance to even be able to apply for some of these federal programs, supports for new and beginning farmers, things like crop insurance. These are all things that we fought really hard for. But even outside of the work that we've done for individual farmers, just mitigation strategies to address climate change, so that farmers are resilient, to make sure that we are modernizing our infrastructure so that a storm doesn't wash out a road or a bridge. These are all things that we have to be paying attention to all the time. Again, back to this Project 2025, which wants to defund the National Weather Service. How does that help small farmers who literally are at the mercy of weather events? So really making sure that we are passing legislation that doesn't just benefit our large corporate farmers and commodities, but also the impact can be felt by our smaller farmers. I want to connect our farmers markets to schools, having markets for these local products. I introduced legislation for scratch cooked meals to create partnerships. I want to increase the number of slots available in our VOAG training programs. So I'm looking at this in a very holistic way to really bring farmers into the conversation, to help give them a market for their goods and access to many of these programs, and really allow them to do the work that they've always done to feed our country. That funding and that spending are policy choices, because what we've seen is that in the wake of a pandemic, we made transformational investments, and our economy is recovering faster than any other economy in the world. So we have to make decisions in the short term and in the long term. We cannot continue to underinvest and disinvest and then just backfill gaps when we have problems. The funding that we did in the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act to address infrastructure and climate mitigation are things that we need to see across the board all the time, so that we don't have such catastrophic damage after weather events. For example, the funding we put in the American Rescue Plan for schools was literally in many places just filled gaps from years of disinvestment. So those policy choices we have to make and make some hard decisions, but it can't just be about now. It has to be about governing for a strong and stabilizing future.
Absolutely, a focus on those long-term solutions. And we know so much of that money came right here to Connecticut and is still coming to Connecticut in lots of other grants in various ways. Obviously, so much more we could talk about. Unfortunately, that's all the time, but thank you so much for taking a couple minutes. We know you're busy in Congress and, of course, on the campaign trail right now. I'm sure we'll be checking in before November, but Congresswoman Hayes, thank you so much as always.
Thank you so much for having me.
And there's still more to come here on The Real Story. What educators and mental health professionals are watching for and working on with kids back in school and childcare settings. Plus, what policies are working, what funding they're still fighting for, and what resources they want all families to know about. Stay with us.